Hi everyone, welcome to another recorded lecture for ENG 434, the seminar in the American novel. With this recorded lecture, I just want to take a little time today to talk about distinctions between the two different sections, Franny and Zooey, in the composite novel Franny and Zooey. And bear in mind, this video lecture is meant to be viewed following my last video lecture that I posted to Blackboard, the one that's labeled An Introduction to Franny and Zooey. So just keep that in mind. View this one after you've already watched that one. So just to get into a little bit more detail without too many spoilers, of course, the Franny section of the novel and the Zooey section of the novel, as I began to say in my last video, these two sections have completely different narrators. Now, I talked about this point a little bit actually in the article that I published that I posted to Blackboard in the same folder under content supplemental materials that you can find these video lectures. So if you take a look at that article, you'll see how I distinguish between the narrator we're presented with in Franny versus the narrator we're presented with in Zooey. However, you don't necessarily have to take my interpretation in that article. Let me grab my bottle of water, one moment, sorry. The one behind me is practically empty, so I've got a new one. Anyway, apologies. Give me one moment while I take a sip of water here. Okay, so as I was beginning to say, the article that I posted and the interpretations I offer of the different narrators in the Franny versus Zooey sections. Do with that what you will. Do with my interpretation, I mean, what you will. You know, I believe what I wrote, obviously, but I don't want you to necessarily take my article or Amy Hungerford's lecture, to be fair, her 40-some-odd minute lecture from Yale that I posted for you as well on Blackboard. Don't take either of us as gospel. I definitely want to hear about, and so in thinking ahead to our next synchronous meeting on October 5th, I definitely want to hear more from you guys about who you think narrates Franny versus Zooey, how these two narrators may or may not be different, because to be fair, credit where it's due, there are more scholars out there of Salinger who argue that the narrator and author, once you get to the Zooey section, this will make more sense to you, but the narrator and author of the Zooey section is actually also the narrator of the Franny section. Now, as you're reading these two sections, that argument is supported by various scaffolding I don't want to get into because it would bring spoilers to the table here, and I don't want to do too much of that. However, that argument might seem odd to you as you're reading. I wanted to make this video lecture specifically as you're moving into the Zooey section of Franny and Zooey in your assigned readings in the course syllabus. So as you're moving into that Zooey section in your own reading, that argument that we have the same narrator across the board might seem a little strange to you. It did to me. And I believe Amy Hungerford, although she makes her argument a little differently than I do, just to be fair, I believe she feels the same. Maybe not the same narrator, but you know, make that decision for yourself. I want to bring that question to the table as a topic of discussion during our next synchronous meeting. So prepare for that by kind of thinking ahead. As for the Franny section, now the narrator we have here, again, I don't want to say too much. My own interpretation you can get from the article that I posted to Blackboard, but predominantly you'll notice as you move into the Zooey section of the book that the Franny section, by comparison, perhaps reads a lot more straightforward. A lot more clear-cut in terms of narrative, having a beginning, something like a climax, and an end, even though not much is resolved at the end. It's not much of a resolution, but there's a conclusion to Franny anyway. Even though many details of her interiority aren't entirely clarified for us, we need to do a lot of that work on our own via interpretation. Nevertheless, Franny, by the time you get to Zooey, might seem a lot more simple of a story, a lot more straightforward. By the time you get to Zooey, and hopefully as you're watching this video lecture, you've begun reading in the Zooey section of Franny and Zooey, the novel. According to our syllabus, I mean, just to kind of give you a sense of where that reading might begin, you're meant to begin reading the Zooey section in Franny and Zooey for homework on Monday, September 28th. So just keep that in mind. You want to get some ways into Zooey before really diving into this lecture. But the Zooey section nonetheless, it's structurally very different from the Franny section. The Franny section is largely set on a date between Franny and Ling Coutel at a restaurant in Connecticut during a Yale football weekend. The end. Whereas Zooey, being a much longer story, which I kind of beat that point to death in my last video lecture, so I'm not going to go back down that rabbit hole. But to be fair, being that it's such a longer story, structurally, it makes sense that Zooey is very different than Franny. It's also, like Franny, one thing it does have in common, to be fair, is that the Zooey section is heavy in dialogue. You'll notice that as you're reading, perhaps by the time you get to page, let's see, I'm going to talk about this fact as well, the point that the dialogue doesn't really pick up as quickly as it does in Franny. In Zooey, the dialogue, there we go, around page 71. I'm in let's see here, the Back Bay Books Little and Brown version of Franny and Zooey, the version that's for sale at the University Bookstore. Now, as you know, in this version of the novel, or composite novel, Zooey, the text of Zooey begins on page 47. But the dialogue, and I said that this section of the book, section of the novel was very heavy in dialogue, the dialogue doesn't actually really get going until page 71. That's a little ways in, right? Now that is within the range of your first reading assignment in Zooey, granted, but that's still a little ways in. The first bunch of dialogue, I should really say maybe block of dialogue within the chapter that you get is between Zooey and Zooey Glass and Franny Glass's, because these two are siblings, as you might have already caught on. Zooey Glass and Franny Glass's mother, Bessie. So Zooey and Bessie, beginning on page 71, are in a particular kind of dialogue together. And as you're reading in the Zooey section of the novel, I don't want to give too much away, of course. As you're reading in the Zooey section of the novel, I'd like you to kind of clock that dialogue a little as you're reading. What do I mean by that? How is Zooey's attitude towards his mother? How are these two characters, in your opinion? How are they communicating? Is this healthy communication? In your opinion? Do they seem to get along well? Are they clear communicators? And so on. Also, when you get into the dialogue beginning on 71, can you tell exactly what the two of them are talking about? Bessie and Zooey, that is. So just a few questions, the first chunk of dialogue in this chapter that you get. A few questions to kind of keep in mind, to think about. Okay, so let's see. Let me see where that first chunk of dialogue probably ends around page, I'd say probably around page 91, where that first chunk of reading in Zooey, assigned Monday 9/28, where that first chunk ends. That's pretty much a chunk of dialogue between Bessie and Zooey. Now, between pages 47 and 71, those kind of opening 20 plus pages of the Zooey chapter or section, if you prefer, that's a little different. That material from 47 to about page 70, there's a lot in there. For one, you might want to be taking notes on these kind of page markers for yourself as you're reading through the Zooey section. And I do realize, unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm working backwards in the section on purpose. So just as we're working backwards, remember we just talked about page 71 to about 91-ish as a chunk of dialogue between Zooey and Bessie. Backing up a little bit. So between, say, pages 56, like the bottom half of 56, I'll show you my book. So here's page 56. The bottom half of 56, I've got an annoying tab here because I've been working on this novel for years. I'll remove my tab for you to see. But this bottom half, the date isn't quite a giveaway. It's a letter. And this letter, I actually have, in my novel, in my version of the novel, I have a paperclip. Word escaped me for some reason. I have a paperclip holding together the section of Zooey that comprises this letter. In other words, here's my paperclip. It's a long letter. Now this letter, which goes from page 56 to about, let's see exactly where it ends. It ends on page 69. It is a letter to the character Zooey from his oldest living brother. I wanted to be careful how I said that. And you'll see once you start reading in Zooey what I mean. There's another eldest Glass family brother. However, he's no longer with us by the time Franny and Zooey takes place. So Buddy Glass is the oldest living Glass family sibling. And he's written this exorbitantly long letter, which spans from about page 56 to 69. He's written this letter to Zooey at a particular time in Zooey's life. Note that. As you're reading. A time in Zooey's life, just to give you a little bit of a hint, a little spoiler, that's rather commensurate, one might say, even though he's a young man at the time rather than being a young woman in college. The letter is dated 1951, which is about 4 years before the story of Franny and Zooey, as I mentioned in my last lecture, takes place. The story of Franny and Zooey takes place in about 1955, which is the year when Franny, the very first story in this composite novel, was published in the New Yorker. So about 4 years prior to this story, Zooey receives a letter, a long letter, from his brother Buddy. And at this point, 1951, when the letter is dated, at this point in Zooey's life, he is trying to think of, he's considering, and the letter gives some great context clues, so I promise. I'm backed up in the text. I'm citing my source page around page 57, 58, 59. The beginning bits of the letter really give this away. At this point in Zooey's life, when Buddy is writing to him, he's giving him advice about what Zooey might want to do with his life following college. That may or may not resonate for you as a reader with Franny's struggles, maybe. Some of what she talks about to Lane, perhaps, especially early on in the Franny section of the novel. So this letter, which goes from about page 56 to 69, is a long letter of advice from eldest brother Buddy to Zooey, essentially about life after college. Professional life, personal life, what it might mean to be personally fulfilled for a guy like Zooey. And I should talk a little bit about his character. I hope to do that at our next SYNC meeting, and so on. It's largely a letter of advice, though. So again, note that for yourself, because that might be tricky to keep track of as you're reading through the Zooey section. Once again, and I can't say this enough, this section of the novel, although it is much longer than the Franny section, but beyond that, it reads a lot differently than Franny. It's much less straightforward. It's much more in the voice and in the mind of its narrator and author, who are the same person. And this is actually a decent segue, still moving backwards from page 69 in the novel. So I'm around page 56 now, right? So between pages, let's say, I think the opening, yeah, I think the opening of the chapter, yeah, between page 47, the textual opening, so here's page 47 in my text, the textual opening of the Zooey section, which technically is demarcated on page, I believe, 43, but nevertheless, beginning on page 47 and going to the top half of 56, just prior to that letter from Buddy, we get some pretty voluminous, read it, judge it for yourself, but we get some pretty voluminous, maybe a bit telling exposition on the Glass family, who they are, where they live, what they've done with their lives in the years prior to our meeting them here in the text. And this is all provided to us by the narrator in the Zooey section of the text. Now, luckily, thankfully, unlike Faulkner, Salinger, at least in this text, keeps the narrator the same throughout the whole Zooey section. Yes, thankfully. So, unlike what we had in Absalom, Buddy Glass, one guy, is the narrator rather, for the entirety of this long Zooey section. So you're gonna wanna note that down. And that, I say that with a lot more confidence than I stated my interpretation of the narrator in the Franny section, because not only have many, many more scholars besides Amy Hungerford at Yale agreed with this interpretation I'm offering you, Buddy being the narrator of the Zooey section of the text, he actually also tells us on page 47 of the text. So he says, just basically, he gets into it even in the first paragraph of Zooey, but the opening line of the second paragraph in the Zooey section on page 47 is a nice giveaway. He goes, quote, "To get straight to the worst, what I'm about to offer isn't really a short story at all, but a sort of prose home movie. And those who have seen the footage have strongly advised me against nurturing any elaborate distribution plans for it." So basically, this is the voice of Buddy Glass. He introduces himself early on in the first paragraph of this chapter. And he lets us know, as a member of the Glass family story, or a member of the clan of characters who are involved in this Zooey narrative, with the story that he's offering us is something other than a story, he says. It isn't really a short story, but sort of a prose home movie. I'm very curious to know what you think of that particular wording, that choice of turn of phrase on Buddy's part. But for me, it reads as though he's offering his readers, as a narrator, as an author, a particular insider's view into his characters. Particularly, and for me as a reader, this has a particular impact on me as a reader, particularly after coming off the Franny section, where at least as a reader, I felt, and I want to get into a conversation with you all on October 5th about how you felt about this, but I felt through much of the Franny section, and as much as I read this book, I continue to feel this way, confused about what is really going on in Franny's interiority, in that opening story to the text, in that brief narrative that essentially motors the whole rest of the novel's plot, if you can call Zooey's narrative a plot. That's another conversation for another day, though, perhaps closer to the end of the text. But essentially, in the opening pages of the Zooey section, we have Buddy, the narrator and author of Zooey, or so he says. He's introducing himself this way to us. First, giving us some exposition on his cast of characters, a little bit of tells on himself and his own idea of himself as a writer. Some interesting, material on that. And then around page 50, he sets up the setting, or at least the beginning setting, of the Zooey story, which on page 50 in my version of the text, there's a page break. And right after that page break, you get some narration from Buddy. And it says, 10:30 on a Monday morning in November of 1955. Zooey Glass, a young man of 25, was seated in a very full bath, reading a 4-year-old letter. So that's a pretty clear, and it's a funny way, very clear expository, setting up the conditions of the Zooey narrative opening. But also an interesting tell following some of the self-deprecating self-criticism that Buddy offers, that Buddy offers as an author in the pages prior to page 50. So at that page break on 50, he lets us know right away where we are, what day of the week it is, the year, the month, who's to be concerned. Zooey Glass, where is he? He's in a bathtub reading a 4-year-old letter, as I already told you, which begins on page, just to refresh your notes if you're interested, this 4-year-old letter, the text of which begins on page 56 in the novel. And Zooey Glass, we find out, is 25 years old. And for the record, as you're reading in the text, if you might have caught it, might not have caught it, he is about 5 years older than Franny. Again, the main character we meet in the first story of the text. So he's a slightly older brother, essentially a middle child in the Glass family lineup. But again, in these opening pages, Buddy does a good job of giving a brief introduction to some of his characters. We get a little bit about their father, Les Glass, some information from Buddy, although he'll adorn this proverbial tapestry as the chapter goes on. But in the opening pages, say around page 48 and so 49, we get some information on Bessie, on Zooey himself through the eyes of Buddy, to kind of open the story. And a little bit about, on page 47, to 48, a little bit about Franny, the quote unquote, how does he describe her? The leading lady, as he describes her on page 47. There's a little bit of expository characterizing information, interestingly, about Franny there, page 47 to 48 as well, that Buddy offers. And again, I encourage you as you're reading through this, and as you get to the part of the chapter beyond, I believe it's beyond page 91, where, let me make sure I'm not lying to you. Yes, unfortunately, beyond page 91, so we can hop ahead a little bit in our discussion here. Beyond page 91 in the chapter, we get Franny, finally, coming back into the narrative as an actual voice, as part of the dialogue again, finally. So beyond that early description of her character that Buddy offers as narrator and author, like I just pointed out, from page 47 to 48, we don't see or hear much from Franny at all, again, until almost the 100s. So pause, put a pin in that for one moment. Franny does come up in the conversation between Bessie, the mother, Mrs. Glass, and Zooey, who's in the bathtub. Do with that scene what you will. I'm very interested to discuss your interpretations when we get together on the 5th. Anyway, Franny does come up in that conversation. So that's an important thing for you as a reader to keep your eye out for as you're making your way between the page where the letter from Buddy ends, which is about page 70, 71, and 91, where the first reading in the Zooey section in the syllabus for you on the first homework reading on Monday 9/28 ends at page 91. So in those pages, look out for mention of Franny, particularly, like I said, in dialogue between Zooey and their mother, Bessie. What do you want to look for? How do they see Franny's condition? What kind of shape is she in, according to Bessie and Zooey? What's going on with her? What kind of help does she need, according to Bessie especially? And how does Zooey respond to this claim of a particular type of help that Bessie Glass, the mother, claims that Franny needs? And again, that part of the conversation, the mention of Franny, how she's brought up, how she's discussed by her mother and brother, slightly older brother, excuse me, links up to, pardon me, links up to the attitude you might clock between Bessie and Zooey, particularly on Zoe's side of the equation, just to be fair, in conversation, in dialogue. So note that. Perhaps the way, in other words, perhaps the way Franny is discussed is a bit of a reflection of how these two characters, Bessie and Zooey, relate to one another. Perhaps it's a bit of a reflection of how their relationship, Zooey and Bessie, is actually going. Do with that what you will. Just a little bit of a detail to keep in mind as you're reading in the novel and kind of weighing out these characters for yourself. Let's see, let me find exactly where, so that when you're reading, it might be a little bit easier for you to kind of find exactly where Franny comes back into dialogue. She's being discussed, spoiler alert, she's being discussed by her mother and Zooey again in the early 90s of the Zooey section, yet she is still not in the dialogue. So you might want to note that for yourself, maybe stick a post-it note in your book or something, that still this far into the Zooey section, we're now almost halfway, just about halfway through the novel. Franny as a character, as a speaking, acting, live character in the scene, has still not reappeared. So do with that what you will. Is that a significant consideration, do you think? Does that say something about Buddy as a narrator, or as a character who does or does not maybe understand his sister? I don't know. All I know is what I wrote in my article and some other ideas I have about these characters. But I leave these questions to you. I'm very curious to know what you think of this. Any significance there might be to Franny appearing so late on the stage, while she's referred to on the opening page of Zooey as the story's leading lady. Some leading lady. Where is she? So let me keep looking to exactly where she pops up. I believe it's on page 99, but I want to make sure it's not right. She said it again. She's like, Buddy, Can't live in a world. No, 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 that's still, we are. Here we go, finally. Mrs. Glass, unexpected singularity. A freak too. Still Mrs. Glass and Zooey speaking exclusively in the absence of Franny, and I'm on page 107 now, so keep that in mind as you're going through the text. Let's see, I thought maybe one of my many post-its in here might have labeled. Finally, yeah, Glass's living room. All right, finally, I thought this might be the case. Finally, Franny Glass appears in the scene at the end of the reading that you were assigned. Right before the end of the reading that you were assigned, right before our very next synchronous meeting on October 5th, ends on page 118. And as a matter of fact, let me just make sure. Yep. And as a matter of fact, Franny does not come into the scene until, so your reading for Wednesday, 9:30, our last class meeting before Monday, October 5th, our next synchronous meeting, number 3. That reading assignment for Wednesday, 9:30 ends here at the page break on page 118. So here's the upper. You only have to read to here for 10:05, our next synchronous meeting. And on that day, your homework assignment is to read beyond into the Franny part of the Zooey section, you know, where Franny comes into the dialogue, where she's a more active character, interestingly. So that's unfortunate, but you are allowed, of course, always, but not, you know, it's not required, but you are allowed to read ahead if you'd like. And I can always extend our synchronous discussion a little bit on October 5th. With you guys, luckily our class ends and it's just my office hours. So if you'd like, we can extend our discussion. Anybody who might have read ahead of page 118 in the Zooey section, where Franny really becomes much more than a topic of conversation, becomes a more active character in the dialogue. Anyone who wants to stay after that next synchronous meeting during my office hours and maybe have a small group or one-on-one discussion with me about her part in the dialogue, about how Zoe's attitude then transfers to her, you know, comparing how he talks to her versus Bessie earlier in the chapter, I would welcome that. I would get such a kick out of that. But anyway, it's not required. But nevertheless, I think that's about where I want to end things for now, because I don't want to give away too many spoilers in advance of our next synchronous meeting. So I'll leave you off there. But those, I think, are some pretty good essential differences to get you warmed up and moving through, you know, from the Franny section, which in my opinion is so different from the Zooey section. So as you're moving through the Zooey section, hopefully this video lecture will help a little for you in marking the pages in terms of keeping track of where the narrative, even though the narrative voice is the same and the point of view is essentially the same, the focus, the direction of the narrative changes a lot over the course of Zooey. So hopefully this lecture will help kind of set you up in understanding those directional changes, so to speak, as you move through the Zooey section. So thank you so much for listening today, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this video lecture. If you have any questions or if something I said in here didn't make sense or seem contradictory, don't hesitate to call me during office hours, of course, or just shoot me an email if that's more comfortable and easy for you. I don't mind meeting with you on Zoom, or we can just talk over email, of course. But that's enough rambling for me for now. Thank you so much again for listening. Have a great rest of your day, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.